Good morning. Diun Sengitamo, Wowatamo, Bipawave. Welcome from Ogapoge, White Shell Water Place. My name is Matthew Martinez. I'm the Deputy Director at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. Though we are not gathered here today in one place, we'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on the homelands of Tewa people who were here long before we called this place Santa Fe. May those joining us from other regions also acknowledge their own homelands, as well as the cultural and artistic contributions indigenous peoples have provided. On behalf of MIAC, we're excited to be co-organizers with the School for Advanced Research and look forward to today's panel. I'd like to introduce Alicia Poon, Director of the Indian Arts and Resource Center at SAR. Thank you, Kunda Woha, and we look forward to continued collaborations.
Thank you, Matthew. When we embarked on this partnership, we not only wanted to acknowledge what was happening around us, but also touch on its ties to what is happening around the nation and across the world. I want to emphasize that this is only one conversation and that there are many conversations out there that need to and should be paid attention to, and encourage you to please seek out those resources. We also encourage you to ask questions and provide comments to the speakers. So you can do that by entering them in the question tab of the right side of your computer screen. For now, let me introduce you to our moderator, who will in turn introduce you to our discussants. Dario Colmenares Mian is Program Director for the Global Transitional Justice Initiative, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience's flagship program on transitional justice, where he is responsible for several programs in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He played a central role in the Center for Memory and Peace and Reconciliation in Bogota since his creation in 2008, where he coordinated participatory truth-telling programs in arts and culture with ethnic and rural communities for nearly 1 decade. He has also been a consultant in transitional justice for several international donors in the implementation of Colombian peace process and has extensively participated in promoting memorialization initiatives in the Latin American region. He has also been a book editor and documentary producer with several Colombian NGOs and institutions.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Alicia. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the School for Advanced Research. I am honored to moderate this panel on messages and monuments around questioned icons of memorialization in public places, and therefore to be in the privileged position to initiate this interesting dialogue with the community of New Mexico. If we can start the presentation with the slides, we can start with the first slide. It's only one, Alicia. Okay. To start this discussion, I would only like to mention, for the sake of context, that this growing concern of the public on the need to remove symbols of colonialism, slavery, and other forms of oppression from public spaces is not exclusive to the US, where many statues of Confederate and colonial symbols have been toppled by groups of activists or have been removed from public sight by local authorities following pressure from communities. In our work and research at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, we have come across numerous examples. While in Latin America, just a few months ago, the statue of a conquistador placed on top of a pre-Columbian pyramid for decades was toppled by the Misak indigenous community. In Switzerland, England, and Belgium, statues of historical figures associated with slave trade have been pulled down by activists or are being considered for removal by local authorities. And here we could think of two questions which we can review in our discussions. The first one is whether moving these symbols away from the public eye is the best way of dealing with the past and promote a culture of human rights and democracy, or whether there may be other ways of tackling these issues, like placing them in a resignified context, such as the statue graveyards of Memento Park in Hungary, the statue they put in Lithuania, the Tallinn Park Museum in Estonia, or the Fallen Monument Park in Moscow, where fallen symbols of the Soviet era are exposed to the public and offer the opportunity of promoting a critical discussion on their new significance. The second question is whether activists taking action on their own hands in toppling statues and monuments is self-defeating, because it destroys the possibility of creating city commissions comprised of local government and citizen representatives to discuss and decide on the matter in what could be the starting point for a local truth commission on slavery, colonialism, indigenous identity, and racism. But to shed light on these issues, I would like to introduce, we have three distinguished guests, which I would like to introduce: Kirsten Buick, Jane O'Brien, and Jason Garcia. So Kirsten Buick is a professor of art history and associate dean of equity and excellence for the College of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico. She's PhD in art history from the University of Michigan. She has been the recipient of fellowships at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and at Williams College, and was awarded the David C. Driscoll Prize for African American Art. Her research and publishing focuses on the visual and material culture of the first British Empire, art of the US, sculpture, landscape, representation, and African American art, and women as patrons and collectors. Her book, Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis and the Problem of Art's History, Black and Indian Subject, was published by Duke University Press. And her second book, Inauthenticity, Kara Walker and the Aesthetics of Racism, is in progress at the moment. Jean O'Brien, citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it well, is distinguished McKnight University professor and Northrop professor at the University of Minnesota. She's one of the 6 co-founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and an inaugural co-editor with Robert Warrior of the association's journal, Native American and Indigenous Studies. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, O'Brien is the author, together with Lisa Blee, of Monumental Mobility, the memory work of Massasoit, Firsting and Lasting, writing Indians out of existence in New England, and Dispossession by Degrees, Indian Land and Identity in Natick, Massachusetts, 1650 to 1790. Her co-edited volumes are Sources and Methods in Indigenous Studies, Why You Can't Teach U.S. History Without American Indians, and Recognition, Sovereignty, Struggles, and Indigenous Rights in the United States, a source book. And finally, Jason Garcia, Okupin of Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, was a School of Advanced Research Native Artist Fellow in 2007. He carefully examines and interprets life around him through his work, often clay tiles created in the traditional Pueblo way with hand-gathered clay, native clay slips, and outdoor firings. His material, closely connected to the earth, present a virtually rich mix of Pueblo history and culture, merged with comic book superheroes, video game characters, religious icons, and pop culture. Many established cultural institutions and museums have acquired his work, including the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, and the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. Jason obtained his BFA from the University of New Mexico and his MFA in printmaking from the University of Wisconsin. Unfortunately, due to technical issues, we will not be able to see Jason on screen, but he's with us. He's the man in black, as we realized a minute ago. So without more preambles, I would like to introduce you to Christine Pye Buick, who will be our first presenter for a short, brief introduction on her views on this subject. Christine.
Thank you, Alicia and Matthew, for having me today, and I thank everyone on the panel with me today for your work and for your vision. I would also like to welcome you to this day. And I don't have visual, I don't have images, but I do have a couple of, I think, good starting points with regard to how we should look at monuments. Next slide, please. So the function and purpose of monuments, one of them is to embody history. And according to the art historian Del Upton, monuments created from the 19th century through the mid-20th century were understood to embody history rather than memory. Scholars currently prefer to interpret monuments in terms of collective memory and to distinguish between history and memory as varieties of recording the past. Although memory plays a central role in the creation of monumental narratives, to understand them, it is important to take seriously the builder's belief that they embody history, defined as objective reality and not an interpretation or a memory. So monuments, the definitions of them, the functions of them change over time. The first two quotes I pulled from Del Upton's book, What Can and Can't Be Said, Race, Uplift, and Monument Building in the Contemporary South, published in 2015. Upton also notes that those who would have Confederate flags and statues to Confederate soldiers remain on public land, share this understanding of the memorials as history rather than memory. As so often, they levy the accusation that those who advocate for removal are attempting to erase history. But I would emphasize that monuments are not history, that monuments have a history. Today, what will be made available to you are a number of sites and resources on monument making. And Dario, may I have the next slide? Another function of monuments are to reconstruct the past. As art historian Josephine Shaya notes, a monument may simply be defined as a structure created to commemorate a person or event, but recent scholarship shows that monuments are anything but simple. Societies use monuments to reconstruct the past rather than faithfully record it. Monuments assign simplified meanings to complicated events. They assign simplified meanings to complicated events, displacing the very past they would have their viewers contemplate. And this is from an article that Josephine Shaya wrote called The Public Life of Monuments. And Dario, may I have the next slide? The other function of monuments is to provide resolution and consensus. As art historian Kirk Savage reminds us, public monuments were meant to yield resolution and consensus, not to prolong conflict. The impulse behind the public monument was an impulse to mold history into its so-called rightful pattern. And history was supposed to be a chronicle of heroic accomplishments, not a series of messy disputes with unresolved outcomes. Even now, to commemorate is to seek historical closure, to draw together the various strands of meaning in a historical event or personage, and condense its significance for the present in a speech or a monument. And this is from Savage's book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, Race, War, and Monument in 19th Century America. And so what monuments in fact expose are indeed a series of messy disputes with unresolved outcomes. We are messy because we are human. And may I have the final slide, Dario? Thank you. And for me, the idea that we are messy and that monuments resolve nothing is confirmed in an event that happened on August 17th of this year, when a Virginia senator, Louise Lucas, was charged with injuring a Confederate monument. And this charge actually flies in the face of everything we think we know about monuments and about objects. Objects cannot be injured. They can be damaged, but they can't be injured. But I think that this charge actually shows our investment in monuments, the stakes in monument erection and monument toppling. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And now on to Jean O'Brien.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank our hosts today, as well as all the attendees who are joining us for this important conversation. I hope I have something to contribute. I'm going to mainly talk about a book I recently published, but also its context. Can I have the first slide, please? Countless anti-racism protests over monuments that have accelerated after the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May announced a dramatic resurgence of struggle over memorialization to white supremacy. These first spiked in the wake of the 2017 Charlottesville rally that resulted in the tragic death of Heather Heyer. These events unfolded just as my co-author Lisa Blee and I were finishing slide Monumental Mobility, the memory work of Massasoit. In the book's preface, we pause to suggest that the vital public engagement with monuments to white supremacy ought to be placed in dialogue with the monumental scaffolding around settler colonialism and historical figures such as Columbus. Monumental mobility is situated in the train of these intense debates over placement, displacement, and replacement of monuments to difficult histories. We take as our case study the statue Massasoit by the sculptor Cyrus Dolan. Next slide, please. Installed in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1921 to commemorate the tercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrims just this November. Dolan's statue was intended to memorialize the Pokanoket at Massasoit as a welcoming diplomat who negotiated the first treaty of peace with the English and was a participant in the mythical First Thanksgiving that stands at the center of American national origin stories. We analyzed the original inspiration for the monument, its design, installation, dedication ceremonies, role in tourism, and importantly, how indigenous public intellectuals have intervened in historical narratives around settler colonialism read through the Massasoit statue. We ask, can the statue prompt viewers to reckon with the structural violence of settler colonialism in commemorative landscapes, or does it further entrench celebratory narratives of national origins? What we found was that the meaning of the statue, along with the story of colonization and the founding of the nation it was intended to commemorate and invoke, continues to evolve. Vital to the force behind these changed meanings is the work of indigenous public intellectuals who are unsettling narratives of national origins. With them, we argued that monuments to settler colonialism ought to be part of our broader conversation about the place and meaning of historical monuments. Next slide, please. A tourist to Plymouth today can easily access a pilgrim-centered story as we did on our research trips by gazing upon a diminutive rock we are instructed to venerate, taking a tour with a pilgrim-clad guide who insists the Pawtuxet gave their land away because they no longer wanted it. Not true. By listening to a visitor center volunteer explain that all of the native residents had died off. We actually heard them say that, and that also is not true. And by perusing the town's gift shops stuffed with depictions of happy pilgrims and Indians sharing feast. The memorial landscape and dominant narratives of its history insulates visitors from uncomfortable truths, even as they purport to bring viewers closer to history by connecting them to what they cast as hallowed ground. Yet with the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival marked just last month, Wampanoag and other indigenous public intellectuals have crafted a more complicated and coherent narrative of New England's past. Unlike most of the memorial landscape in Plymouth, which freezes the town as an English place, these educators create ways to introduce visitors to long excluded experiences and perspectives. Next slide. Tourists can join Tim Turner on his native Plymouth tours, where indigenous Patuxet becomes visible and the crowded memorial landscape on the waterfront can be reevaluated from that perspective. Next slide. They can visit the traveling exhibit Mashpee Wampanoag Paula Peters helped create, or view her videos about Wampanoag perspectives on this history on the Plymouth 400 website. Visitors may feel discomfort that comes with new awareness of a more complex reality and history, but they experience a more realistic narrative of the past. The monument, including the Day of Mourning plaque added beside the Massasoit statue at the behest of New England Indian activists, next slide, opens a fascinating window onto the process of historical memory formation. Here, indigenous people insist on a reckoning with the past and the present that refuses narratives of frozen Indians in a place sanitized of the violence and trauma of settler colonialism. Historical memory is contested rather than resolved for once and for all. It is revealed as dynamic, interactive, unsettled, open to interpretation. Indigenous people use the statue to explain settler colonialism as a structure, indigenous dispossession set loose at that moment and continuing as a system of oppression, rather than invent the peace treaty or mutual defense lines, depending on your perspective. They refuse to be frozen in this narrative, but instead insist that the past be reckoned with in a way that includes their perspectives on history and the ongoing ramifications of their lives under settler colonialism. Imagined from these multiple vantage points, Massasoit finds a place in a highly mobile interpretive terrain that unsettles rather than fixes historical narratives in bronze and stone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean. And now Jason Garcia. Well, unfortunately, we cannot see him, but then we can listen. Jason, can you hear us? We have technical problems, but I suppose you can hear us.
Yes, go ahead. I'm here.
Okay, yeah. So then on to Jason, yes. If you would like to share some thoughts before we start the questions.
Thank you, Tomo. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Garcia. I'm from the Pueblo of Santa Clara, which is also named Ka'olinge, which is Rose Path, and we're one of 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos here in northern New Mexico. And then there's also one in northern Arizona that migrated in the early 1700s. So just recognizing them as well, that they're part of our community. So I was just going to talk today about some local monuments here in northern New Mexico. And the first one is the equestrian statue of Juan de Oñate. And he was, quote unquote, the first colonizer of northern New Mexico. He had come out in 1598 to a Pueblo, Yungue or Yungue, depending on your Tewa dialect, which is near the Pueblo of San Juan, or Okeawinge, as they're called now. And this particular statue was erected in 1994 in Alcalde, New Mexico, at the Rio Arriba County. And Oñate was from a silver mining family in Mexico, and he had come north to, of course, find riches, and part of the goal was to colonize New Mexico. But also he brought the colonists out, but his goal wasn't necessarily to colonize as many people say he did. He actually was moving all around northern New Mexico and went as far up into Kansas and other areas as well too. He is part of the entire looking for the fabled cities of gold, despite not finding it. After 50, 60 plus years, they were still on that quest to find it. And then also Oñate was part of a massacre at Acoma Pueblo, that is west of Albuquerque. And he had many of the, his nephew had been killed, and in retaliation for his nephew being killed by Pueblo Indians at Acoma, he had set amount of time of indentured servitude for the Pueblo people, and then had also cut either the right hand or right foot of different individuals there at the Pueblo, and that was his punishment. So there's a lot of historical and cultural trauma regarding Oñate with Pueblo people of New Mexico. You know, he's not this famed colonizer. He's the conquistador still yet. He's still the conqueror. He's still the enemy to a lot of Pueblo people. Next slide. Equestrian statue had been removed on June 15, 2020 by the Rio Arriba County. It's on Rio Arriba County land at a place that was a cultural, or had originally been intended to be a cultural center. So, you know, this is 2 years after the quincentenary, 1492. So there's kind of that fervor amongst a lot of different populations looking at, the 500-year anniversary of quote unquote the discovery of America. And so I know they had were receiving different threats, and I think the county felt it was probably easiest, cheapest solution was to remove the statue and then have it stored away for a time period, and rather than having protesters remove the statue forcibly. Next slide. And then this is the La Jornada, the journey, which is created also by Reynaldo Sonny Rivera, who was the same artist that did the equestrian statue there at Alcalde. And he had also worked with Betty Sabo on the piece. And this is at the Albuquerque Museum in Albuquerque. And this one shows more of the quote unquote journey, the more colonized aspect. But, Oñate is still seen, wearing armor, carrying, the proclamation of the colonization of New Mexico, but it's not as, what would you say, not as depicted as like the conqueror with the armor and coming to kill the Indians and conversion, but there are still symbols of conversion and with a Franciscan priest behind him, and then also being that this statue was created 12 plus years later, there's kind of a different aspect in terms of the representation and symbolism of the art and the sculpture and the image of Oñate. Okay, next slide. And then so on June 15th, which was the same day that the Oñate statue had been removed in Alcalde by Rio Arriba County staff, the protest led to protesters forcibly working at removing the statue. And then there was also a group of New Mexico militia members that had were the counter protesting the statue and I guess in the sense, quote unquote, protecting the private property and not allowing the statue to be, I guess, injured in that sense. And so one of the militia members had shot one of the protesters that were protesting the site and the statue and things like that. And then the following day or so, the city of Albuquerque took it upon themselves to remove the statue of Oñate, and then also a couple of the other soldiers that were located on the statue. So there's an image with the arrest of some militia members, and then also the city removing the Oñate statue. Next slide. And then also, so being Oñate, there was a lot of fallout that came out. And Oñate Hall is one of the residency halls there at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. So, there's pretty much a large consensus of various people here in northern New Mexico that are interested in removing, or the erasure of certain names, Oñate, off the name off the hall. And then also there's the Fe Fiestas that are celebrated in the city
next to that borders and is also on Santa Clara ancestral tribal lands, and there's a lot of checkerboard areas as well too. There's a annual fiesta that celebrates Oñate, which is a group of local costume players or cosplayers that dress up as Oñate, and then they have celebration, carnivals, dances, things like that. And I know in the past 2 years there's been a lot of fallout as well too, and some of those fiestas were in the past supported by the actual city where they receive funding, but I know in the past year or two they've cut their funding, and so they're more of a privately held event. Next slide. And then Don Diego de Vargas was another Spanish, I don't know, conquistador is the best word to use. Another one that came into Santa Fe after the Pueblos had revolted in 1680, and were able to successfully remove the Spanish for a period of 12 years here in northern New Mexico, and had pretty much chased the Spanish out to El Paso, Texas. And so for a period of 12 years, there are no Spanish people, soldiers, colonists. And in 1692, de Vargas returned with a group of soldiers, and then also again colonists, but mainly soldiers, looking at forcible entry into northern Mexico and into Tewa country as well too. And it's commonly called the quote unquote bloodless reconquest, but there were multiple revolts that still continued to happen in 1694, 1696 within Tewa country and the Tewa Pueblos here near Santa Fe. And this is a statue that was located at the Cathedral Park in Santa Fe. And Santa Fe, like Dr. Martinez had mentioned, is the ancestral Tewa village as well. Tewa, the traditional Tewa name is Oga Poge, Winge or Poge. So, we still recognize, our Tewa places or our Tewa names and things like that. So there hasn't been that erasure of our cultural identity and our cultural language. Next slide. And then early on the morning of June 18th, after the fallout from the Oñate statues that had occurred, 2 to 3 days earlier, the city of Santa Fe had removed the de Vargas statue pretty much either pre-dawn. I know that they were working on the Santa Fe, the Obelisk that's located in the Santa Fe Plaza. I have an image as well later. So I know with different various local groups, Three Sisters, Red Nations, and then also a couple of the Pueblos, they had spoken with the mayor about having some of the obelisk removed, and I know they had tried to, or the city staff attempted to remove parts of it, but it was too heavy for the equipment that they had on hand. So I know they took off like the top cap and then left it, but then they removed the Don de Vargas statue from the Cathedral Park, and that's been put in storage as well. Next slide. And so each year around September, the Santa Fe Fiesta usually happens around that Labor Day weekend or so. And again, this is a costume play, cosplayers, local Hispanic, Mexican locals gather and celebrate the quote unquote bloodless reconquest of New Mexico. And again, this is one of those things that that Kirsten had mentioned too, about the creation or reconstructing the past, and this is part of one of the early reconstructions that the Museum of New Mexico and white anthropologists, as they came into the area in the early 1900s, created this as a way to boost tourism and things like that. So a lot of some of those early meetings and early cosplay and the early script has been changed since those early days. And you know, the fiesta has evolved over time as well too, with the burning of the Zobra, the entrada, food booths, rodeos, different things like that. And then in September of 2017, the protests grew larger and several Pueblo people had been arrested, and the entrada and the public play had been switched different times. You know, they had originally said they'd do it at 11 a.m. and then to kind of I guess allowed to have the play, but with less protest, they actually decided to change the time an hour or two earlier. So then they didn't meet as much protest as they had originally expected, and police and SWAT teams and everything were on high alert that day with the plaza. And then the next slide is the removal of the obelisk that happened on Indigenous Day, October 10th. October 12th of this past year, or this year rather. And the obelisk is a memorial that was erected in 1856, I believe, to commemorate the New Mexico militias, the Army, United States Army, in terms of their battles with various quote unquote savage Indians, as you can see, had been etched out in the 1970s, and somebody has written resilient Indians. And this was erected as a monument to the Union soldiers, and then also soldiers of Kit Carson as well, who was later New Mexico territorial governor. And it was used to commemorate the military actions against tribes, Apaches, Navajos, and others that were considered threats to the American expansion of the West. And then the next slide is the Kit Carson Obelisk, which is located at the Campos U.S. Federal Courthouse. And this one on all four sides is a commemoration again of Kit Carson and his scorched earth policy. He had removed the Navajo people to the Bosque Redondo in the mid 1800s, and this was also commemorating his victories against the Navajo and Apache peoples of that time. And there was this after all of the removals of the obelisk and I guess the injury and the defacement of the property, there was a barrier that was erected around this particular obelisk that is located north of the main Santa Fe Plaza. And there's right, if you were to go over there, there's probably at least 4 to 5 federal police stationed around the area. And this is on federal land, so you know this has a different ownership versus the obelisk on the plaza is the city of Santa Fe. So this one has a different ownership as well too. And that's the last slide. And thank you also for all joining us and allowing me to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Well, I see we have seen very interesting examples. Jason gave us many local examples of our dilemma that we are discussing from the beginning of this webinar. And there is a thought that I would like to share with you, is that we often find that once an armed conflict is finalized, and I'm speaking about transitional justice processes around the world, across the world in contemporary times, once the armed conflicts are finalized, the memory and memorialization becomes the battleground. And that's a very interesting process because there are many unsettled issues that become relevant and symbolized in that conflict around memorialization, around monuments, around markings, and that's something we see in across the world in many different countries. But the thing is, this is normally related to a recent past. In this case, however, we are seeing many of these conflicts surfacing from a more distant and more remote past. So that makes it particularly interesting, but that doesn't change the general structure and pattern of human nature, of this need of the public to express their conflict and concern in relation to the symbols once the conflicts, the physical conflicts, the armed conflicts are finalized. So then I would like to ask a question for the three of you and have a sense of your interpretation of this issue. The following question: throughout history, we have seen many examples of monument destruction as a result of political changes. Some see this as a beginning of a new era, but others see this as the disappearance of a footprint linking to the past. What do you think is the main gain or loss in removing monuments of a contested past? And that's a question for the three of you. Who wants to begin?
I'll begin. I liken monuments to exposed nerves, and for the most part, they are offensive to someone, and they rest in the background until an event happens, and suddenly they become hyper visible again, and they become the instruments through which we can express our discontent and our objections to the way that public space has been arranged, to the way that public space has been interpreted. And so I would say that both the erection and the toppling of monuments are necessary handmaidens as we negotiate history, as we negotiate public space, as we negotiate our place and our space within society.
Thank you, Kirsten. Do you want to add anything, Jean or Jason?
Sure, I would jump in there. I think that's a really great way of characterizing it. I haven't thought about them as open nerves, but they really are. They're offending and or honoring somebody all at the same time. So I don't know what the answer is at all. I think this is an immensely complex conversation, and I'm really happy actually that we're having it on a national, international scale right now. And I think that the solutions are local, right? And they need to engage diverse audiences and diverse perspectives. And I'll go to the Massasoit Monument to give an example of one way that can happen is, so this is a monument that has the status of fine art. I mean, it was constructed by a very famous artist at the time, and it's beautiful. And it really has nothing to do with Native commemoration. It has to do with the commemoration of white settlers, right? But what has happened, and actually the statue doesn't mean that much to Native people, except in the following way. Beginning in 1970, the Native peoples there started what's called the Day of Mourning, that they commemorate every Thanksgiving. And it's a protest movement in which Native peoples make their arguments about them being here and what all that means and what all this history does and how it's been erased and silenced in wrongful ways. And I showed the monument, the marker that they had erected in the mid-90s there, which was erected by Native activists. And it's a counter-narrative of Thanksgiving that is there for people to read alongside the original monument boulder. And Lisa, my co-author, and I have found, I mean, in interviewing people that pass by, when people read that new marker, they actually take a very much more complicated history away from the monument with them. And so that's an example of using a monument that doesn't make a ton of sense to Native people and making it pay off in a different sort of way. That's just one example. I mean, some monuments just need to go down, right? In others, I mean, I'm thinking really about monuments to Jim Crow and all of that white supremacy monument business, but in general, they're complicated.
Thanks. In two opportunities, somebody from the audience has pointed out that we are speaking too quickly. And well, maybe we are very much aware and self-conscious in relation to the limit, the time limit, the time frame that we have. But then, well, okay, we will do our best to be a bit more to lower the pace for this for the descriptions of our complicated, complex points of view. I apologize for that. Yes, sure. Thanks so much. So there's another question. I'm seeing a question from the audience from Karen Baker. So what are some other approaches to dealing with these controversies? So we don't ignore history, but also don't venerate the cruelty. And then in relation to that, I would add, I would maybe address this question to Jason, because you have a very outstanding production in modern time, in a modern time vision of traditional arts and symbols. Maybe it would be interesting to listen from you and your view on the fact that apart from the simple destruction of a monument, there are other kinds of interventions that we can think of that can turn these monuments into an opportunity for social dialogue in dealing with the past. You have done that extensively in your tiles and other examples of your art, but maybe it would be interesting to listen to your view in relation to monuments, statues, and markings. So what could you share with us, Jason?
Yeah, like Jean said, you know, it is a very complicated issue in terms of monuments and memorials to the past of you know, there's so much cultural and historical trauma associated with it. You know, there's different people that celebrate the fiestas and they mean different things to different people. And I just think of it in terms of like my own family of family members in the 1950s and 60s, you know, going to Santa Fe and celebrating or going, I guess, in the sense to quote unquote celebrate, you know, go see the burning of the Zobra and going downtown and doing different things. But maybe the focus wasn't necessarily on the Entrada or the quote unquote bloodless reconquest of New Mexico. And you know, some of those things have changed over time, or maybe there's that cultural or historical trauma has just was buried so much that, you know, and which is the case with a lot of people are saying like, oh, well, we don't talk about that, or don't talk about those times, like just focus on the positive, don't focus on the negative. Sure, that monument in the center of Ogapoge of the Santa Fe Plaza, you know, it memorializes, you know, a killer of Indian people, but well, let's not talk about it. Let's just focus on the beauty of the city and, you know, tourism, and you know, we're attracting tourist dollars to create an income for our work and things like that. So, you know, that might be part of that. Not necessarily ignoring it, maybe just kind of pushing it aside, but knowing that history is there, or knowing what that awareness is, and that was part of my original ideas of some of this work that I had been creating. It's one of the body of work that I've been working on is the Tewa Tells the Suspense, which is using Tewa historical events, migration stories, cultural stories, and putting them in a graphic novel or a graphic comic book context, and that's putting it on clay tiles or creating prints, hand-pulled prints that are showing the history. And again, it's those things of the research that it's going into it, of what did individuals like de Vargas, Oñate, and Coronado, and what did they do to our Pueblo people? Why are we here? Or understanding history about like the siege of Black Mesa in 1694, you know, where de Vargas had our Tewa people had sought refuge on top of Black Mesa, but that history isn't really known or isn't really talked about, and so part of that was showing the other side of how our Pueblo people have resisted, you know, over the years, and still continue to resist in different manners. You know, it's just more from maybe a legal context in terms of asserting their rights regarding natural resources, mineral resources, and other things. And I think that's part of that, of just showing that sometimes a lot of these issues aren't necessarily pushed under the rug, but they're fought in so many different ways, whether that's the actual physical toppling of the monument, or a Pueblo speaking with the city of saying, like, you know, you guys really need to change this, and we understand that there's maybe a process that might be more take longer rather than just going in and pulling it down. So there's so many different viewpoints and perspectives, and that's part of the art of being the artist, is that you're observing and documenting and trying to reflect all these different viewpoints rather than just keeping one perspective. And I think that's the thing about memorials and monuments, that there's so many perspectives surrounding, you know, this the monument, and which includes erasure of people as well too, or a group of people.
Thanks so much. Now that you've mentioned the comic books and other cultural products expressing these conflicts, this reminds me of one of the questions that I would like to ask for Jean to answer, because you have extensively worked on the need to include the perspective of the indigenous peoples in the way the U.S. history is taught. So how do you think, or how does the conflict around icons and colonialism and slavery translate into this other public space, which is history books, for the educations of new generations? Or how
Thank
could
you for
it?
asking. Thank you for asking that question. I'll try to speak slowly. I think I tend to speak quickly, sorry. So, you know, at the end of the day, ultimately, monuments of that sort, to slavery, to Jim Crow segregation, to Columbus, are about power, right? They're about declaring victory, as you started the first question with. They're about saying who's going to dominate here. And those, I mean, that's where a lot of the really big debates around monuments are happening, is around that kind of monument, right? So I think we should be clear about that. What they are also doing is erasing other versions of that history. So they're part of this larger struggle about whose history counts, whose history is going to get told, and, you know, ultimately what people are going to learn about what this or any other nation is in terms of its past and its present, and how the present connects to the past. So what I find, I don't teach US history surveys. I never have. I teach Native American studies surveys. And what I find every single time I teach my undergrads is that they are angry that they've never been taught this history. And if you look at the textbooks, even college textbooks to this day, almost nothing about Native people appears after 1890 with the massacre at Wounded Knee. we can't hold our students responsible for this. It's the history they're taught, but they're not happy about it when they discover that they've been taught a very biased history that focuses on the white settler origins of this nation, almost to the exclusion. Well, certainly of Native people. I mean, African American history is more included, not as much as it should be, and the histories of other underrepresented people who are citizens and people of the nation. So I think those are connected, and I think it's important that we tackle that as a broader issue about the stories that this nation tells about itself. I hope I answered you.
Yeah, sure. Yes. And then we have a few very interesting questions from the audience, but I would first like to ask one question to Kirsten. Since you have researched extensively on the legacy of visual and material culture in the US, and the historical process of the shifting the context, and also the way the symbols are, well, evolve over time. So in that sense, what has changed in our political and social context over the last decade that has brought this need to redefine public spaces to the spotlight?
Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge the words of Jason and Jean in particular, and emphasize that monuments do not exist in isolation. Often they are, as Jean says, they're about power, and often they are planted on the sites of lynchings or in front of natural history museums that contain the bones of First Nations people and looted ritual objects. And so they do not exist in isolation. And students are, they are both angered and thrilled to learn this version of history, to learn this alternative version of the history that they see all around them. And in my opinion, what has changed has been the advent of people like Jean, people like Alicia, people who have entered the academy and now who can speak back to the academy and influence what is taught there. And so what has changed have been the students and the students' consciousness. I think that what we see now in the public space is not the race war as fantasized by white supremacists, but an alliance of people who refuse this particular articulation of public space. Young students across various definitions of ethnicity and race and gender who have aligned themselves against white supremacy. And given the fact that we have left them with very little in terms of resources, in terms of a planet Earth that is dying, overburdened by student loans, you can't afford to go to school, you can't afford not to go to school. They are understanding that power is not in a statue, it's not in a memorial, that power is to be found in the alliances that we make with one another. And so my hope, my understanding of change lies in our young people.
Thank you. I would like to bring to your attention one of the questions from the audience. Jean Boudreau is asking, how shall we frame the discussion about the relative value of removal by protesters versus redisplay in a better context? Who wants to jump in and discuss this?
Well, I'll jump in and say a couple of things. I want to actually thank Kirsten for the kind words. But I agree with you about our students, and my hope lies as well. So as I said earlier, I do think these have to be local conversations, but they're infinitely complex. So I'll take a specific example from where I am. In St. Paul, in the wake of the George Floyd killing, protesters pulled down the Columbus statue that sat on the grounds of this Minnesota State Capitol, along with all the other statues coming down. This was part of that big movement. And that statue remains taken down. And a Native man was arrested and charged with a felony for his role in bringing it. There recently was a plea bargain that they came up with this week, which I think was a good solution. But some people are mad about that because they want to see him punished. So one of the things, now there's going to be a big conversation that happens about what goes on with that statue. And in our case, actually, the person who's going to be leading the conversation is our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, who happens to be Ojibwe. She's pretty adamant it's not going back up. But where it's going to go, we don't know yet. One of the things people were mad about at the time is if you want that statue taken down, go through proper channels. Well, Native activists here have been fighting that statue for 20 years. I mean, what are you supposed to do? So, I mean, I think one of the things that's happening with protesters pulling statues down is we haven't gotten anywhere in this conversation. So I guess the hopeful side of me about where we are now is maybe we will now. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Kirsten or Jason? Okay, I would then
more time just to clarify.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, please. Jason? No.
I can
well,
jump.
what is a better context?
Okay,
you know?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right. Because often
that could be the question. What is a better context?
Those monuments can sometimes weigh tons, and we don't have the spaces or the infrastructure to house them. We don't have the will to hire people to take people around them and reinterpret them. And so the question around relative value of removal and then redisplay somewhere else, it can be just another way that the state stalls in this process of constantly renegotiating public space, so that nothing gets done while we wait for that space to be built and shored up so that it can actually house those tons and tons of metal and crap in a lot of cases. Because if you can pull a Confederate statue down and neck bends, it tells you that it was created out of very cheap alloy and just put in place to reaffirm Jim Crow, as Jean has so eloquently stated. And so we can't allow, and we aren't allowing anymore the stalling tactics of the state.
Well, that brings us to another thought is, well, definitely we see unaddressed community voices, which struggle to get place and to open a space to discuss with the official narratives. So the question is, how can unaddressed community voices be brought to dialogue in redefining monuments in public spaces? Do you see any opportunities for new forms of memorialization and reconciliation around 21st century values? I mean, beyond the immediate tensions and conflicts around monuments?
Monuments continue to be built. Trump's wall is a monument, more so than a functional barrier. His star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood is now covered and roped off because people take sledgehammers to it and they urinate on it. And so, monuments can be now found in the strangest places, and they are contested. And I would argue that the ritual, it's all part of the ritual. The erection, the contestation, the removal, it is part of a whole. It is our passion play. It's another way that we have conversations.
We have many other questions. I don't know if maybe Alicia can help us with reviewing some of the questions, because I've been trying to organize these, but that would just take a minute. I can point out one of them, which is how do you feel about monument graveyards, like the one in Moscow that was spoken about earlier? That's a question by Rebecca Crockett. Who wants to discuss this specific issue?
I actually would like to hear what Kirsten thinks, but I just would weigh in and say it's a fascinating idea. It would require the kind of commitment of resources and infrastructure that Kirsten pointed out people are not very willing to put out there. It would also involve interpretation, right? So I don't know. What would you say?
I think of plantations as a monument graveyard that that can't be interpreted or reinterpreted in satisfactory ways. People go there still to have their fantasies of the antebellum South. They have their weddings there. They get angry on the days in which slavery is emphasized, and they complain, well, my family never had slaves. Why do I have to hear about this? And so the creation of monument graveyards are indeed graveyards. That's what they are, graveyards. And to the extent that in contemporary society, we are unwilling to confront illness, let alone death, it's something that we push away from ourselves and can't engage in the ways that it has historically been engaged. It is just taking space that could be better used, maybe for low-income housing, or you know, places where high-speed internet servers can be set up to service communities that are underserved. And so, you know, we're constantly dreaming up ways to misuse space. And in my opinion, a monument graveyard is a graveyard and a misuse of the living earth and living space.
That's really interesting. Wow. And I want to just throw in, do you know about the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana? It's this incredible, it's a plantation site, but it's dedicated to calling out slavery. And it is I've been there, it's a really, really powerful experience, but I agree with you with everything else you said. I mean, it's just it's a great way of putting onto that point you're making.
There's an interesting question in the audience. Emily Santanam is asking, can you talk about what you think the roles of history and art museums should be in preserving, curating, and recontextualizing museums that have been removed from public spaces? That is more in relation to the role of museums and well, the role of museums in this redefinition of removed symbols. Who wants to share thoughts about this?
I worked in a major museum in Chicago for 4 years as a museum educator, and when I finished my dissertation, I deliberately did not go into museum work because museums are incapable. They are incapable, given the redefinition of what we call art into an aesthetic function away from a use function. Museum curators are trained to see objects as aesthetic. They don't want those things in their spaces, and they don't want to give back the looted objects that exist in their current spaces. And so museums are not the solution. As Jean said, the solutions are local. And museums because of their priorities are not the solution. You have to look at where the curators were trained. Look at what they published. Look at the dissertations they wrote. Look at who they studied under. Museums are not the solution.
I would agree with Kirsten as well too, with the museum of that. Museums are a storage place for, again, that conquered culture, you know, of using the example of various museums where they have an American Indian collection or a Native American collection, and you know, there's bones, ancestral remains from various pueblos, and they're a storing house, so they're used to study. And you know, there's no I mean, they're required by NAGPRA to kind of take an assessment of what their collection holds, but they're not necessarily required to return it. And then also sometimes tribes don't necessarily want them back because there is, you know, no way or no ceremony to properly curate or properly reburial happens and things like that. And items of collection regarding, you know, the quote unquote vanishing race, that's part of it as well too. So I don't know, museums aren't probably the best example or have had the best example of curation, of storage, of acquisition of items and displaying the culture. You know, it is displaying the victors, you know, this is my trophies, essentially, this is my trophy room. And it's also who are the funders of those museums. You know, if you say major museum in Chicago, immediately the Field Museum comes to mind. So who's the money behind that, you know, or who's the money behind all the major museums in America, and you know, across internationally as well too.
Yeah, and also related to that,
there are museums that are trying to change that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just saying, I think there are some museums that are trying to change that narrative and working more with communities that they have collections, but that's, you know, it's just a land acknowledgement. It's performative at times too, you know, so it's really difficult. It's really difficult.
Yes, related to this, there's a question from the audience. In the case of post-Soviet states and other post-war examples, direct colonialism or war is over. But here in North America, the colonialism continues. In that case, are we fighting these symbols as a tactic in decolonization? Are there other international examples you can think of? I would, well, that's Robert Caldwell is asking this question to me. That we find numerous examples of struggle between symbols, and not necessarily related to colonialism, and some of them related to most of them related to finalized conflicts, of course, but some of them are developed in relation to conflicts that are not yet settled, which is the feeling that I have that relates this this example, well, the many examples that you find in North America with, for the conquistadors statues being pulled down in Latin America by indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples who do not who do not portray themselves as belonging to the mainstream system of justice and culture, and because, well, I will just very briefly explain. The Colombian Constitution grants rights for the indigenous peoples for a special jurisdiction, a special indigenous jurisdiction. So in their territories, they can rule according to their traditional values. So then they feel in many ways, threatened by symbols that are put in places where they should share the views, where they would expect the state to be multicultural, and they find these statues to be unicultural and hegemonic, and so that is more the case in, for example, Latin America. We have a few examples in Asia, but the interesting thing here is to ask back. I would ask back, as I'm not that much aware of the context here, in which ways colonialism continues, and how does that relate to symbols? And that's maybe a question for our historians. Kirsten, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, history is an ongoing project. It is not that thing in the past. In fact, we make the past usable to ourselves in order to understand the present. Public space is not static, and we shouldn't expect it to be. It will always undergo change, and we should embrace that change. Whether it is the taking down of a monument and replacing it in, in a monument graveyard, or what happened with the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia. What was a monument has become a memorial. It has become a memorial to George Floyd. It has become a memorial to Black Lives Matter, as the public continues to deface that statue. And so the acceleration in the destruction of monuments, or the taking down of monuments, is part of history. It's part of the fabric of history.
Well, just to jump back to a more provocative way of questioning or asking, I find an interesting opposing points of view here, because somebody from the audience points out that at this point, I feel that this narrative is somewhat prejudiced towards the Native American viewpoint. No mention of the advantages colonialism brought to New Mexico, such as technological advances, advances in agriculture, animal husbandry, and metalworking, not to mention, etc., etc. So let's very briefly touch this. I'd like to hear, for example, the point of view of Jean and Jason in relation to those who believe or to understand this as an overly biased discussion to favor the position of Native Americans.
Well, I'll just jump in and say we're finally getting a voice. I mean, it's well past time that our voices be heard in narratives that have tried to write us out of existence for now centuries. And so there's that point. Then there's also the point of improvement to whom? Who does the defining of improvement? One of the things I like to suggest is how is the atomic bomb progress? How is ecological destruction progress? That's obviously kind of a rhetorical question, but this is not so simple as who gets to say the way it is. You need many voices. That's, I guess, how I would start to answer that very deep and complicated question.
Good. That very much relates with a similar discussion that you would find in Latin America, where many indigenous people see the central government's position as representative of the white plastic culture, producing so much pollution in plastics, which is very much opposed to the way that indigenous communities do their packaging of foods and their treatment of foods. So then from that, there are many discussions that stem out of that. And that's what I really find interesting about this discussion is listening to both points of view. I understand the need to establish a platform or a space or some scenario for the dialogue between these two opposing, or maybe it's not two opposing, it's more than two, it's like 10, 20 opposing visions of many things related to the behavior of the state institutions, and also the other citizens and other sectors of society. So this really relates to the general need of an open dialogue in relation to these symbols. And this reminds me of something that we have been discussing in the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience with the Santa Barbara Trust in California, in relation to the redefinition of symbols and the relocation of markings, statues, monuments, which is the relevance of curating an exhibition, an online exhibition, because when you mentioned, I think it was Jason that mentioned something about documenting this process, or maybe it was Kirsten. But then that reminded me of an idea that we have, how interesting it is to be thoroughly documenting these protests and these of these conflicts around statues and monuments, so that the documenting itself and all the material production around it, including pictures, including statements, including the visions of different community groups, could turn out into a very interesting exhibition. Now that we are all confined, at least we can have an online exhibition of these conflicts, which will bring us to the need of establishing some citizen commission to start discussing the truth about the past. That's an endless discussion, of course, but I think that this forum is the starting point. And I say this because I have to close. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So, but I just want to point out from an outsider point of view, that's the interesting thing, is having worked extensively in transitional justice, but being external to the American, the US conflict, but also aware of conflicts around memory across the world. I see that there is a need for establishing a platform for dialogue between the opposite sides of this discussion in relation to iconoclasts and maybe conservationists, and well, you name it, you have plenty of different positions in relation to what should be done with icons and symbols. But then that, in a way, would be my secret way of inviting you to continue this discussion in these spaces and forums that I am sure will interest the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the SCR, and we may be talking about this in the future. I would just open for a couple of comments if anybody wants to add anything to this. Otherwise, we'll have to be.
Just to go back real quick on the last point that you had made about making it a better life. You know, we think about animal husbandry, like you said, and you know, how has that affected, you know, our own populations regarding obesity and diabetes and things like that, and then also the environmental consequences of the Manhattan Project on the local Tewa Pueblos here. You know, destruction of water, soil, mineral resources, homesteading, quote unquote, land stealing, all those things, you know, so the squatting. So, you know, what was better, like you said, what exactly? And then now as we're returning back to, you know, more organic lifestyles and more subsistence living, like Jean had mentioned with the plastic culture, you know, what was great, what's great about it. And again, just emphasizing that Oñate was the owner of a silver mine, and he was here looking for money, That's what number one goal was. Second, souls, conversion of souls, and then third was colonialization of the land stolen. So, what was great about it. So just to end on that point.
Fantastic. Yeah, that proves my point that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the very end
Exactly.
of a long
Tip of the
thread
spear.
of open dialogues that we should encourage, and we will definitely find very fruitful for society to develop. Thank you so much, and I apologize for all those questions that we didn't address, because I saw that we had like 40 questions. We only answered maybe 10. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Jean, Kirsten, Jason,
Thank you all. Thanks for
Elise,
coming.
Matthew, and thanks to all
Yes,
our
thank you for
attendees for coming.